There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of fear around AI. According to Citigroup, AI is likely to displace more jobs across the banking sector and industry, really, than any other sector. 54% of jobs across banking have a high potential to be automated, according to Citi. Do you agree with that? Does that sound about right, Derek and Deb?
I do think there's a potential to have a high percentage of jobs automated, but I also think there's a great potential to bring a lot more efficiency to jobs, you know, when we think about some of our early use cases. So I do think there's a lot of potential with what we're doing with both AI, traditional AI, as well as generative AI.
So I think that the assertion that there's a lot of opportunity in banking is probably correct. If you look at our bank at JP Morgan, we are most focused on the domains of technology, customer service, and operations as having the most transformative impact of Gen AI, and that would be roughly maybe half the bank or something by head count. That said, I always say that I think it's very difficult to actually try and put projections out as to what the future state will mean. And the reason is because banking has a long history of other very disruptive technologies, the mainframe computer, the ATM, online banking. Back then, many predictions were made around what the future could look like. And while people 25 years ago thought that the bank and bankers could be questioned, in reality, we have more banks now than we did 25 years ago.
Yeah, there's a Chase branch on every corner of Manhattan, it feels like. So to that end, the ATM has not displaced people. Let's build on what Alexandra said and to learn where and how specifically your firms, which, as she showed us, are both included in that Evident AI Index, are applying AI across your many, many businesses, consumer banking, consumer finance, commercial banking, capital markets as well. Derek, let's start with you because you represent JP Morgan Chase, and as Alexandra was showing us, it's far and away the leader here in terms of building this AI presence. Can you share specific examples of current use cases for how AI and Gen AI is currently being deployed at Chase, at JP Morgan Chase?
Yeah. So we went live with our first generative AI use cases at the beginning of the year. In 2024. We started work on them at the beginning of 2023, and at that point we were learning around the technology, putting in place the necessary governance, risk and control frameworks, etc., and that allowed us to go live at the beginning of the year. The first foray into generative AI use cases were quite basic. They were focused on just using an out-of-the-box model as is. That had very helpful utility for applications like summarizing articles, summarizing research, providing first drafts of documents or content, etc. But much more power began to get unlocked when we were able to connect generative AI models with our own internal data. And that then unlocks the field of very much more sophisticated knowledge management systems. So if you think in a bank, there's lots and lots of different job families where it's needed to get quickly access to information and answers. And generative AI provides a very helpful interface to provide very precise answers based on that. And as we look forward, we're looking to tap into more and more connectivity of this technology into our systems.
Yeah, I would say similarly in terms of the focus on pretty common use cases around knowledge search assist. At PNC, we've taken a very deliberate approach, and we have our use cases are still in the pre-production state for generative AI. And we are also looking at assisting those frontline employees, could be call center agents, branch employees, where they've got thousands of documents, you know, that they may need to look through for information to provide to customers and clients. So that is one approach. It's also being used internally as a tool we're looking at, again, in pre-production to assist our technology and our developers. So when you look at generating code for a new product, new capability, new solution, how do we leverage generative AI to help kind of with, if you will, a first draft of what that code may look like for our developers to be more productive?
You both mentioned some phrases that I want to ask your clarification on. What does pre-production mean versus in production?
For us, pre-production means, so we look at doing, and sometimes it's in an innovation lab environment, doing a proof of concept. So understanding with the data, because having good quality, accurate data sets is incredibly important, often very, very large data that we need to work with. So we experiment with that, sometimes in a lab environment, proof of concept, and then we start to move into pilot phase. So not fully in a production environment yet, but getting feedback from our users as far as, is this accurate, is it working, before we're ready to go through all of the approvals, checks, et cetera, to make sure we're ready to move into production and actually have a broader set of employees using it. But all of ours right now are non-customer facing. We're focused on bringing efficiency gains to our employees.
At what point will it become customer facing, do you think, Derek?
I think it will take some time. We also do not have customer-facing use cases at the moment. All of the use cases are internal-facing. I think there's a natural sequence. First of all, you would expose it internally, and then once you get comfortable with it, it demonstrates its value and get comfortable, then you could turn that outwards. But at that point, the risk profile does step up quite a bit. There's been some very interesting news anecdotes around from other companies who have gone live with Gen AI-based chatbots. And there's been misspecified pricing, misspecified terms that have even turned into lawsuits. And the legal precedent that's being set is very, very clear, which is that a customer-facing AI channel is an extension of the company. They are accountable for what an AI system sends. And therefore, I think we'd want to be very careful before we would go live with those.
So that's really interesting you bring that up. I'm curious to hear where you think it's not possible to use AI or Gen AI across your bank right now. Are there any parts of the operations that are still in your mind, AI proof until there's more data to work with, there's more real-life examples to work with?
So I think that let's take a look at where the technology is now and where it's going. As it is today, there's a lot of domains that are still sort of AI proof. And even take a look at the legal domain. Lawyers today are trained with years and years of domain expert experience, and the best of large language models struggle with the high confidence to get those exactly right. But I think we would expect that gap to close in the near to medium term. These models will only get better. And so if you take, I think your question is more directed over the longer term, what types of jobs are going to be secure. And it's a little bit speculative, but a few things that I'd point to. One is that customer relationships are always going to be high value and irreplaceable. I think finance is always going to have a very big element of human trust, and so relationships are going to be very important. And as well as AI systems get more and more and more sophisticated, they'll be extremely good at creating drafts, filling out the materials, thinking through steps. The scarce resource will really become the innovative idea. So the people who can have the innovative idea, those will be the ones I think in the highest demand in the future.
And I think the other thing to differentiate is traditional AI is very different than generative AI with a large language model. So a much higher bar from a controls perspective and a risk framework on the generative AI side right now. So traditional AI, that is much more broadly used across domains because there are so many different ways to leverage that pose less risk, but it can also bring the value of efficiency and opportunity.
Okay, so note to self, I can encourage my son to be a lawyer, but only in the short to medium term before that job becomes taken over by AI. We know that AI is expensive. You have to pay for the software, for the tools, you got to hire talent. We're talking about data scientists, engineers, software developers to then develop the applications. I'm curious to hear from you what the spending trajectory looks like at your firm. Is it something that resembles NVIDIA's stock chart over the past 2 years where it's like this and then it shoots up? Or is it more like the Federal Reserve's interest rate increases, kind of incremental, and then plateauing for a while?
Yeah. So I think to answer that, first of all, the question around investment in AI is already a difficult term to quantify. And the reason is in JP Morgan's case, we've publicly disclosed we've invested $2+ billion on data center modernization, which means uplifting the modernized data centers, moving into the cloud, that infrastructure, et cetera. And that AI is a direct beneficiary of that. So does that get included in AI spend or not? Another lens to take on it is just the data science and AI talent that is building the models. I think though in your two options, I think it's much more like the Federal Reserve. We have been steadily increasing our investment in these areas, but it hasn't seen NVIDIA type spike, and I think we'll continue to increase at a steady pace over time. The only other point that I would add is the areas where we're investing, we are seeing a slight change in composition. So in the past, in in the past years, there was a lot of focus on getting the model developer, the AI practitioner, the people building the models. And that's going to continue, but increasingly now, because of the availability of very powerful third-party Gen AI models like ChatGPT and Anthropic, et cetera, there's now a different type of skill set to talk about bringing those on board, using those, and connecting those to systems. That's a little more of a engineering-dominant area. So we see the composition changing a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree as well. I think it's kind of a more like the Federal Reserve example you made with the interest rates. But I think one thing to keep in mind, again, differentiating the cost of implementing large language model solution, often depending on the type of data you're using, if you're using it for something broad like fraud or in banking, anti-money laundering, some of those fairly common use cases, there's so much data involved there. The costs for hosting and the compute cost, if you will, to use those models with all of that data can be very significant. So one thing we're really looking at too is making sure we've got a really good, consistent, solid approach on your business use case and make sure we've still got the ROI opportunity even with significant costs up front.
Is it difficult to convince your CEO to spend on AI, or is this something where they're kind of throwing money at you?
Jamie Dimon has not needed convincing that AI is the future. He's been on record a number of times. In fact, it was, I think, really attributed to him back in 2019 that we were one of the very first movers and big spenders in the AI domain.
Yeah, I think our approach has been a little bit more deliberate. I think where we've got a very clear, solid business use case opportunity and we demonstrate that we've managed the risk, and then we move forward on those in terms of our portfolio.
You mentioned something that piqued my interest, which is about, fraud and bad actors and what can go wrong. And again, we go back to that fear versus hype scenario where there's a lot of concern out there. Let's talk a little bit about the fear factor here. What's a nightmare scenario that keeps you up at night that is something you need to think about? It may not be, around the corner, but it's kind of something out there lurking.
I think one of the scenarios there is, especially with large language models now, the ability to create something like a deep fake or something that will convince an employee or customers that this is our firm reaching out to them. This is PNC. So that the technology that's enabled now to do some of these deep fake videos and things like that, and other ways to, I'd say, even enhance, accelerate some of the potential of the typical fraudster scenarios and scams. That's something that, we've got a lot of focus on. How do we make sure we're educating people? How do we make sure we're taking additional precautions to protect everything we're doing, as well as using it, to advance our own use cases?
So it's almost more sophisticated versions of what people have kind of already been exposed to.
There's definitely some new opportunities as well, but definitely it can really enhance the quality, for example, of a deep fake video to really, I think all of us have seen them in different formats, could convince you it is, a senior executive or even just, a call center agent or somebody legitimate that's requesting information from customers.
Yeah, it significantly lowers the bar and lowers the cost for adversarial actors to come and do the things they've always been doing. And deepfakes is one example, but cyber attacks are another. And given that AI is now very good at generating code, that allows the automation of malicious code to be able to try and poke and prod at levels never seen before on a security perimeter. Or if you think of biometric voice, using voice to identify, at very, very low cost now, fake voices can be created to try and fool those types of systems. I think that banks need to be very, very aware of how on every single front the malicious activity can be turbocharged with this and uplift their own controls, of which one big element of that is going to be more sophisticated AI as well.
Right. So, Deb, I know you've talked about the need for a nutritional label, like something that kind of allows you to itemize exactly what's going on, be very transparent. Can you talk a little bit about the use case for that and how you see it being implemented?
Yeah, this is something we've talked about internally and also with some of the external groups we partner with, is something analogous to a nutrition data label that if you were using, whether it's in-house, so we're sharing it with employees, potentially customers, or if it were using a vendor, third-party partner, Giving some basic information around what data is used to train this model. When was, what's that time period? When was it last trained? And just some basic, consistent information that would help inform and understand, what the output of the model is. Because oftentimes, that can be a little bit of a black box.
Who's asking for these nutritional data labels? I mean, I know it's, for use internally, but are any external players actively seeking this out?
I don't know. We don't have any of those use cases in production yet, but it is something we're proactively looking to do to provide that information and definitely have that sort of disclaimer as well as basic information provided when we do have large language models in production.
And the thing, of course, Derek, with AI and banking and financial services is your industry is highly, highly regulated. So that speaks to the idea that those of you in banking need to move very deliberately and move very cautiously and kind of make sure you're safeguarding all kinds of things. If you could grade regulators on where they stand on AI, what grade would you give them, the U.S. regulators? Are they ahead of the curve, behind the curve? Are they averaging, what, C, C+?
It's interesting. I think it's a mixture of both. On the one hand, on a very positive note, because banks have been using models in very important decision-making, like credit decisioning, for years and years and years, there are very mature regulatory frameworks put around that. Model risk management, independent review, fair lending requirements. And the nice thing is that even when you move into an AI or a Gen AI world, a lot of those carry over and address many of the risks that are of concern. So when we ask around what's the risk about bias in Gen AI, there's a whole litany of regulations which have just addressed those in the past which carry over. So in that sense, when we sit down with CEOs of tech companies, they actually say that the regulated banking system has amongst the most mature of regulatory environments in around AI. That said, the flip side is that while a lot of these concepts poured over, they don't exactly port over. And so generative AI begins to challenge some of the concepts a little bit, and thus there needs to be a bit of adaptation and fine-tuning. A great example is that model risk management was mostly envisioned around a framework where a bank builds its own model and then there's a second pair of eyes. Now we get into something like a foundation model like ChatGPT, where it is really a black box. We have no idea. And so how do we think about that in that concept? So there is some uplifting to do, and regulators are very, very aware of that. I applaud them for, I think, being very proactive on getting themselves educated. But I think the rules still need to be written as to where the target state lands.
And I have an audience question here I want to bring up and incorporate into our conversation. You both can see it. In which areas of the bank have you had the best results in implementing AI, and what type of applications would these be? Who wants to answer this first?
I would say from our perspective, again, this would be more traditional AI. So conversational AI or document AI, where you're extracting data to simplify. In terms of best results, probably in some of the call center environments where you have a large number of agents, for example. And so any value you can bring in an area where you have many agents or, a large operational area like that, those are probably areas where we've seen the best results so far to date.
Yeah, I would agree that the most value from AI in bank has been and is coming and will continue to come, at least in the near term, from non-generative AI, basically predictive AI or machine learning. And specifically, it's in the domains of fraud, credit, marketing, and pricing, and a little bit of operations. And I think that you would find that to be quite consistent across the large majority, if not every bank. As we look forward to generative AI, the most value over the near term, I think, will come in and around knowledge management. So taking every employee that needs to be able to gain access to information quickly, be it in a call center, financial advisory, a sales function, an operations function, and using a sort of co-pilot framework to very, very rapidly get a very precise and curated and accurate answer quickly, and that will boost general productivity levels.
You guys work at different size banks. PNC has about $566 billion in assets. That is 1/7 the size of JP Morgan Chase. When it comes to implementing AI, When is size a benefit versus a hindrance, do you think? Derek?
So it's a bit of both. On the one hand, the size of JP Morgan has allowed us to invest more. And I think that the past decade has showed that size has been a strategic advantage for a myriad of reasons. And indeed, we've seen market share consolidation across the largest banks. So that's helpful. At the same time, the largest banks bear the highest bar for regulatory standards. And so that in itself has a cost in terms of the number of control requirements, time spent with regulators, et cetera.
Yeah. I'd say from our approach, we've been able to be somewhat targeted in where we apply AI and continue to have regular updates with our, senior executive leaders, with our board, with our regulators, but literally looking at where do we leverage that will bring the most value to our business lines and prioritize in that way.
I want to also end with talent, because that's a big question for a lot of people, certainly as we talk through the nightmare scenarios of jobs being replaced. There's a popular phrase that keeps coming up whenever we talk about implementing AI, human in the loop. And Deb, you had explained to me that basically means you need a fact checker, a person, to make sure that the machine is spitting out the right stuff. So, yay, we have a purpose. How has the commitment to AI in the financial services industry changed the way that banks think about hiring? Will banks still need, I don't know, entire classes of junior bankers, summer interns, the way they used to? Because a lot of the grunt work that they were doing, the mundane stuff, can be shuffled off to AI.
I don't think in the short term we are going to see any reduction in the need for our summer interns, our new college hires, for any of the programs that we have. I think it actually can be viewed as a positive. I think they may be able to, earlier on in their career or their internship, whatever it is, be doing more value add work, because we can do more automation with some of that more mundane routine work. So I don't see that in the short term.
I agree with that. I think that even in a world, you could say you could press a button and instantly get a wonderful investment banking pitch book. Then all that does is it just ups the baseline of the competitive norm. The best of the most competitive players will still always find a way to add some sort of special sauce, some sort of differentiating. Maybe they'll make some sort of marketing video. Maybe they'll do something spectacular, creative in different ways, and that's how you're going to win business. In addition, there are going to be new aspects of jobs which need to be created. In a world where AI can create automated investment banking pitch books, there has to be a whole new job function stood up around the knowledge management of that. How do you curate, sanitize all of these documents, think about the proper entitlements, et cetera, connect models into that? That's a lot of work that nobody's doing today, so that's going to create needs. So I don't see a world where the talent intake is necessarily going to change.
Are those jobs that you need a computer science and STEM degree in, or is that something that humanities students, those who go to liberal arts colleges, can gain the skill set to do and find a career path on Wall Street for?
In today's world, I would happily take a top all-rounder athlete over a specialist in a technical discipline.
Deb?
Yeah. I would agree. I think coming from a technology, security background and area of the bank, realistically, we do recruit more in the STEM areas, computer science, engineering, but I have also seen people be incredibly successful as they transition, from other areas. At some point, it's also just, what your mindset is, what you want to learn, how you advance, kind of moves past your educational background.